For me, the plan mode is tactical context engineering, right? Spec driven is strategic context engineering. That's how I think of it because you are thinking long term. Because if I'm going to be writing code, I'm going to live with AI written code for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and I need teammates involved. I need a collaboration pattern there. So that's where I need durable context for that.
Krishnan's long career in software development spans enterprise, consulting, and startups, including 3 where he was the founder or co-founder. Today, he's the founder and CEO of Polarizer Technologies, which he promises the name has nothing to do with politics. It's about physics. Polarizer helps enterprises adopt AI-augmented development practices at scale. He has over 2 decades of experience spanning platform engineering, building product startups, enterprise transformation projects, and technical advisor. His recent work at intent-driven development has been fun reading for me, and I've been working on getting him on the show. Hari is also our guest today on the Engineering with AI podcast. All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Hello, Carl. Nice to meet you. And again, thank you for having me on the show. Very glad to be here.
Glad to meet you. We never got to work together, though we have some colleagues and friends in common. So that's always nice. So like I mentioned in your bio, I mean, what you've been writing about on intent-driven development is some really great reading. I'm considering you sort of a go-to source for people thinking a lot about spec-driven development, for instance, which I'll be honest, I haven't done a ton of this. I do tend to write a fair amount for Claude or Gastown Mayor or whoever it is I'm talking to, but I don't tend to spend a whole lot of time thinking about things as specifications. I think of a notion context you're talking about the domain or something like that. But I know that there is a whole ecosystem around it. So can you talk a little bit about your article at InfoQ and how you see this space?
Awesome. That's a great question to get started with. In fact, my introduction to spec-driven development was early last year when Amazon launched Kero, and it really piqued my interest, and I was trying to take a look at what's going on here. So that's when I realized there is this whole point about context engineering, which is going on. Essentially, when we're vibe coding, like using Cloud Code or Codex CLI for that matter, we largely have just a conversation to deal with. Like I ask for something and it gets built, right? But there's no durable sense to that conversation which I have with the AI. And I'm not really conversing with the AI. I'm treating the AI as a tool on the desk rather than a person at the table, right? Like, and as AI has gotten more capable, that's what I think is a key difference, to treat the AI as a partner in thinking, to build through as to what we want to build. Eventually, we did have plan mode and Cloud Code, which kicked off quite a lot. And I used it extensively, but then that was perishable too, because after that conversation, plans disappear. Now they have some, capability to do that. But in the long run, the details that we
It's still not a spec.
it's not spec. It's not durable. So what I was looking for essentially is some place to store my decisions that we arrived at as durable context so that in future I don't start from scratch. Because otherwise, all I'm left with is the code base as the only thing to look at and start from. And being the probabilistic engine that coding agents and their models are, every single time the interpretation could be different. So I don't want to, again, teach the same concepts back to it, right? It's, if I were to bring the analogy of training a young engineer, I would like to give him or her give them the full help that they need to begin with. But on a day-to-day basis, I don't want to start them from day one, right? I don't want it to be Groundhog Day for me. I want them to retain that knowledge, the long-term memory bit. And that's when I stumbled upon spec-driven development, and that's where it's been going. So what is spec? So obviously that is a very, the term spec itself is fairly semantically diffused, as Martin Fowler would call it, and in the article that they put together. But to me, largely, it's about durable decisions and context, way to effectively engineer context. And that's one of the reasons I call it intent-driven development rather than spec, because spec is anything, right? But rather what I'm trying to communicate to the coding agent is my intention. I'm trying to articulate it as to what it is rather than saying, hey, build me a nice little website for signing up for my newsletter.
Right.
I could dream of something, but I want to get into the details. So that's where I would start it off with. And that's in my head, spectrum development.
Yeah, I like to focus on intent. Like, and now one of the things I keep saying is like, talk to it about the domain. Don't tell it why, that old agile, user story format as a this, I would like to that. so that reason. I think the so that is really important. The more you tell it about like what's going on, the smarter it seems to get, you know? To your point, I spend a fair amount of time trying to think about what my intent is when I'm talking with Claude, usually, or Gaston Mayor or whatever it is, and trying to get that across. So how do these systems formalize that? Or how does maybe you have a specific system, but let's think of it generally first. How does this formalize that process of reifying an intention or saving an intention? How do we do that?
Right. So maybe if I can do a little screen share that might just help to visually
Yeah.
orient like what we're trying to do. Before I get into how spec-driven development itself puts a system around the context and durable decisions, vibe coding interaction looks something like this, right? Like we have the humans, which is us, and then we're talking to a general purpose agent or something like Claude Code, and there's code in between, and that's both the context as well as the final outcome, as we would call it, right? And at the bottom, I have something called an intent to implementation deviation. I'm trying to map it out. So initially, it's all great. Like, we start with a little bit of we don't understand each other. And then as we iterate and give it feedback on the code that is generated, I review, give feedback. It starts to align with me. But then as I go along, eventually I have like a weird point at which it takes off on its own and has a mind of its own, and I have a meltdown and the AI agent has a brain freeze. And the fundamental reason is the context window. We got to keep that in mind, right? Which is this is popular paper lost in the middle. I'll share a link later for this, but the whole point is the context window, however big it is, the more you start using it, you start getting it into the so-called infamous dumb zone of the model, and you start losing important decisions. So the way spec-driven development addresses this is largely through a way of formalizing that discussion which we're having with the AI. So you still have the humans and the general purpose agent in between, but what you importantly have is you're trying to engineer context here. So that becomes a separate lane here. And you have four phases, not getting into any particular tool. But my observation of the ecosystem is that every tool largely has like a discovery phase, which is where we're trying to address what are we trying to build from a business case point of view. Then we have a design phase, which is the how, like what is the technology implementation for this thing. And then eventually a tasking, like, let's break this down. Like this is story kickoff, for example, right? And get that task list reviewed fully. And only then do you get into coding. So if you notice in the swim lane diagram, the context is what you're building all the way through. And it's only towards the end that you ever get to the implementation. So through this exercise, you're going from low alignment all the way to high levels of intent alignment. And only then you let the coding agent build. So which means you could have it build more complicated stuff rather than simple web pages, so to speak,
Got
right?
it. Got it. Okay, so if I think about how, especially when I'm trying to do sort of a new thing, this is
Hmm.
kind of what I'm doing in a way. Like I even went into like my Claude MD and said like, hey, let's brainstorm before you get into plan mode. Because I find that once it gets into plan mode, it's really dog it. It's like, is my plan right now? It's like, no, you still don't understand. So brainstorm before plan to me has been really helpful. This kind of feels like that, where it doesn't like really start until we've gone through a lot of phases of alignment, as you say. But maybe I'm sort of doing it informally, and these tools are more formal in that approach. Or yeah, help me understand.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What's so different about it? So the first difference is plans. For some, I mean, if you want them to be, they are perishable, technically speaking, right? If you want to, you can retain it in the new Cloud Code. Again, you can say which directory you want to retain the plan in, and you can read them back. And that's brilliant feature that I think they've introduced. But that said, for the longest of time, these artifacts, the context artifacts, were perishable. When I mentioned about the division, like between discovery, design, and tasking, those are independent conversations which we're trying to have. There's a framing to it. So, for example, in the discovery phase, we could be doing user stories and acceptance criteria for a feature, which is a very well tested conversation mechanism to elicit intent. And eventually, when you get into technology, now you discuss the technology pieces in with that particular business domain in mind. Then putting these two things together, you can task. And this creates a unique advantage which I've observed in my experience, which is each of these conversations are independent. So I could do them with different models, so to speak. This could be a high reasoning model like I like GPT for putting my stories together. I like Claude to do my architecture. I like Gemini to probably task it and then eventually build it with something else, right? So I have that ability to split it up and use the models. And I could even use an adversarial mechanism, like, have
Yep.
this reviewed by another model, etc.
Yep.
So that's
Yeah.
one of those things.
Even asking Claude to review Claude is sometimes very useful. I can only imagine having Gemini review Claude. Yes. Okay. Okay. That's cool. And I think another thing you're hinting at that I maybe didn't get in my initial question is what I described. I'm just dumping all that into context. And I mean, it's nice that, Opus 4.6, 4.7 have million
Hmm.
token context windows, but it has to start all over again tomorrow or even an hour from now when
That
we
is
start
correct.
the next thing. And I have some mechanisms that are kind of get me what I want in that all's session start, where like this session will be saved, and it'll summarize what we learned and summarize what we did and what files we changed. And some of the intention, gets saved in those summaries. Claude's own plans, I find, don't do what I want. They do
Hmm.
something, but they're not good enough. But even the sessions that I'm saving right now are a little bit ad hoc. I have to remember, oh yeah, it's this session where we did that. And I sort of have to tell Claude, go read this session. This is the one that's going to be helpful. If I forget, it's useless. And sometimes they're not perfect. So maybe that's what this is adding is instead of dumping all this great context into, our million tokens of context, this is more like what? They're getting saved along the way? Are there
Yeah,
steps
they're
here
getting
where this
saved
is
along the way. In
cool?
fact, if you don't mind looking at some code, so that's my actual um, production, so to speak, for my website, the intent-driven.dev itself. And these are all my features that I've built over the period of time. And this is
Okay.
durable context. So all that conversations which we saw there, they're getting captured as markdown files and they're being
Got it.
saved here. And that's archive which I'm showing you. But eventually, I have like a first class way of
Oh,
representing
cool.
my whole
Wow.
feature set. So, which means it doesn't start from the code, doesn't have to, which means I could throw away the code for all I
And start
care
again.
and
So this
rewrite.
gets into that Phoenix architecture conversation then,
Right,
where
exactly. Like how Chad was talking about it. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, interesting. Okay. Okay. Now I'm getting it. This is different then. All right.
yeah.
Cool.
In fact, that's a great point you made. And the way I call that is the difference between what is plan mode versus spec driven. For me, the plan mode is tactical context
Yep.
engineering, right? And spec driven is strategic context engineering. That's how I think of it.
Yep.
Because you are thinking long term. Because if I'm going to be writing code, I'm going to live with AI written code for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years,
Right.
and I need teammates involved. I need a collaboration pattern there. So that's where I need durable context for that.
Right. Plans will have some value in a few days, maybe a few weeks. Yeah, and maybe even if we're doing a deep dive, maybe they'll have value in a few months. But you can't just stitch them all together and have a specification for the system. That's not what they do.
That's
So
not what they do.
okay, so the goal for this is closer to that. Cool.
Correct.
Okay, well, what's the landscape like? As I understand it, you're the maintainer for one of the tools in this space, Open Spec.
Correct.
So what's the ecosystem look like? You said you started with Kero,
Oh yeah.
which we had a previous guest that talked about Kero, so that's cool. But tell us about the other ones and how OpenSpec compares.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in fact, I personally like Kero a lot. They were the ones who initially popularized the term spec-driven development in that context, right? So and they also used the EARS format, which is I think it stands for easy acceptance, whatever that is, right? Which is closer to user stories format, and I really loved that. And you could quickly switch to user stories if you wanted. The only problem, or rather, while I loved using it, it was a sort of IDE and the setup put together, right? It's one Kero download that you do, and it's not like a CLI tool, so to speak, right? The experience is brilliant,
Mm,
but that said, it's an experience you're buying into and you're getting into. No qualms at all. But then I had my own setup, like I'm a VI user, and I'm probably living mostly in my shell, and I like CLI tools, and that's
yeah.
when I got into SpecKit. So GitHub SpecKit became very popular again around the time frame mid last year. SpecKit also introduced the same sort of idea. You could use it with any model. It's model independent, technically speaking. So that was like a big draw to me at the beginning. Even Kero allows you to switch models if you want to. But then
Mm,
CLI was my big draw. So I could go into my VI setup and start using it. And
right.
then I started looking at OpenSpec because SpecKit sometimes felt a little too of a heavy hitter for small little things like, I'm trying to do something small and I don't want to be caught up specifying for the entire day. I want to get going with my job. So that's
Yeah.
when I started doing OpenSpec. And eventually, that's when this article came out on Martin Fowler about the three types of tools. And I think Birgitta did a brilliant job of conceptualizing what is three types of spec-driven development. One being spec first, which is you author the spec from the point of helping you think through the problem statement. but the
Mm,
spec itself is not really a permanent artifact, so to speak, right? Maybe you use the spec first, from there you develop the code, and then you also modify the code by hand, technically speaking, without going through the spec. So, which means the spec and the code need not be in line with each other. It's just a way for you to get started, right? It's
okay.
a soft start, but the reality is, in due course, the spec is not representative of the actual code. So that's one way of doing it. And I felt both Kero and SpecKit were falling into that category. But I
Mm,
wanted something more. I wanted a spec to be the primary driving surface. I didn't want to modify code directly because my mental model is inside the spec, right?
right.
So then this term comes in, which is spec anchored. That is very brilliant in the sense that spec anchored is at all given points in time. Even if you're modifying the code, technically speaking, there is some mechanisms put in place to say the spec and the code are always in lockstep, which means could technically verify what's breaking. And if a new feature addition inadvertently breaks a older feature, etc. So I wanted a spec anchored sort of tool, and that's when I realized OpenSpec is having that kind of interesting twist about it, where it has a top level spec which is representative of the overall application state. So that's one. And then finally, Birgitta talks about the spec as source, which is eventually where I want to get to, which is there's no touching the code. Any changes will always happen through the spec. And that's the kind of tools that Tessel, etc., are. For example, at least what they were trying to do. I haven't used Tessel in quite some time now, but that's the kind of way of looking at it, right? So visually, if I were to show you what this looks like, I'll just take one more moment to get my screen.
I'm glad you mentioned Brigida. I'm working on getting her on the show.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, brilliant. That's good.
Yeah. So this would be a good teaser.
I think she's done a brilliant job with the kind of structuring that she's come up with there. So
Yep.
this is how we looked at initially, right? Like we looked at the tooling ecosystem.
Mm,
We had strategic and tactical is the plan mode place, and that's where you have anti-gravity, cloud code, and all of these tools sitting around.
yep.
Now, when you come to this guy, this is where the interesting pieces are. I mentioned about spec-driven development and the levels of spec-driven development, right? So that's where
Hmm.
OpenSpec arrives at the spec-anchored, range of things, and the rest of it, the SpecKit and Kero is more about spec first. I haven't
Hmm.
seen a tool which I would say is truly spec a source, but that could be just my lack of knowledge around the
Mm,
entire ecosystem. But at least in what I've explored, I haven't seen a tool which is like a proper spec a source, so to speak.
okay. Well, if I may, we had a past guest on, Jeff Langer, and
Hmm.
Jeff, it's not so much a tool as like a syntax approach, but
Hmm.
he's been working on this thing AATV, which I'm gonna get it wrong, but it's like development, assisted AI assisted development
Sure.
with verification. That's what it is. AI driven development with verification. And
Hmm.
basically, what he's writing is these. I think of them as looking like lambdas because they have little fat arrows. But like, he'll sort of give a name to something, and then fat arrow, and then he'll give a description of what that thing is supposed to do.
Hmm.
And it's just sort of a syntax for that. And he feeds that into, like, say, ChatGPT and says, like, go write me code. So sort of the combination of this and an MD file that explains the kind of code that he's looking for.
Hmm.
And it, I don't think Jeff is claiming that this is true, like Phoenix architecture, like you could start from the spec, but I think he thinks it's a very good way to be sort of test first, at least.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's possible that something like what he's doing there could be seen as spec as
Quite
source.
possible.
It'll be
Yeah.
interesting to find out. Yeah. Yeah.
That kind of leads into what is the specification format which you rightly put in there, right? Like, does the
Right.
format lend itself for verifiability? Like, if it's just plain English, then obviously there is a lot left to interpretation, right?
That's right.
If there is some
Right.
sort of syntax to it, if there is some sort of deterministic way of verifying it, that's the name of the game. Essentially,
Yeah.
even Anthropic's own best practices says the best way you can use a coding agent is to give it verifiable intent. It's the last word on it.
So, and to your point, you intent driven development, right? Like that's like what you're all about.
Precisely. Yeah.
Does OpenSpec take that forward? Like what do you say
Oh,
an
yeah.
intent looks like?
Oh, yeah. So the way OpenSpec does it is quite interesting. Hope that's visible. Okay. So this, I'm sure we can recall the swim lane diagram from a little earlier about spec-driven development, how we had the design, discover, and all of those phases, right? Now, spec-driven development with OpenSpec follows a three-phase approach. It's got largely three commands. You propose a change, you apply that change, and then you archive that change, right? So proposal is where you go through creating the various artifacts like user stories, acceptance criteria, if you will. And from there, you create the tasks and whatnot. And then eventually you review those artifacts. Like that's the first step, what's happening here. And then once you're good to go, you're happy with the intent that has been articulated in these artifacts, then you apply the change, which is where the tasks are executed by the agent, which ends up creating the implementation, which is your code itself. That's apply. Once you've built this out, then eventually what you do is this most interesting phase of this tool, which is when you archive it, it goes into two places. This spec, which is a change spec, initially starts out as a delta. What I mean by a delta is every spec says the feature which is being added as part of this change is modifying such and such from an existing code base, it's deleting such and such from existing code, and it's adding this, etc. So because it's a delta format, I can sort of treat it like a ledger, right? I can start attaching these delta on top of each other and create a source of truth. So what happens is when I archive, it bundles this up and creates a top level source of truth specification, right? And that source of truth specification is representative of my current state of the application. And it archives the rest, of course, that you saw earlier, which I was just showing you. This is very unique to OpenSpec when compared to, let's say, SpecKit or Kero, because they have a ledger, not really a ledger, they have a record of what all happened. You still have independent folders for each feature, but then there is no world view or top level view of what's going on. And the natural problem with that sort of stacking things is when I create feature number 10, it's possible that I've knocked off feature 2 as part of feature 10. So if I actually take the entirety of the spec and say, is this valid today? Even at a conceptual level, that's not true because I don't have a worldview of what's going on. This source of truth spec is the unique piece of OpenSpec, which kind of lends itself to Bugita's spec anchored, so to speak. Again, that's my interpretation of how I'm
Got it.
looking at it.
Right. But you're not claiming spec as source. What's the limit there? You're saying the
The
code is
spec as
still an
source
important.
for me is the
Yeah,
gold standard should be it's 100% verifiable, right? I should be able to, let's say, go do some mischief in the code and I unintentionally modify. Let's say I'm a new engineer on the project. You've been using SDD tools for some time. I do not go through that route of using spec as source. I actually modify the code for whatever reason. And the system should stop me from doing that, right? Like it should say, hey, you're broken spec. That I haven't been able to fully get. I have a duct tape solution for it, but I won't say I have a fully
I see.
functioning solution yet. And that's one part which is pending.
So okay, so it's not so much. You're not saying that you couldn't use OpenSpec to work in a spec as source way. You're saying you don't have any guardrails in place in OpenSpec to force a spec as source approach. Do I have that right?
That is correct. I don't think we have today. How do I put it? It depends on the specification format and what you're using, right? So the like OpenSpec itself does not limit you from making it spec as source. It gives you all the basic fundamentals, right? But then if the specification format you choose or the amount of detail you choose to put into it is weak, then the verifiability of intent is also weak, which means it's like having a test case with weak assert statements, right? Then it's obviously going to have like loopholes to game the system.
Well, and that's another question I had when you said earlier that, oh, implement tasks and that's the code. I thought to myself, well, yeah, and also the test suite. Does OpenSpec have an opinion on how tests are generated? Is that hidden in this diagram and it's just a zero in one of these boxes, or is it outside of this flow?
So whether we use how we generate tests and what all of that, right? Most of the spec-driven development tools, some of them are very opinionated about it. OpenSpec doesn't really say you have to write it in a certain way, right? But you could choose to do whatever makes meaningful sense. For example, I use Gherkin syntax to define my acceptance criteria, and I directly translate Gherkin into my acceptance tests. So that way I can do ATDD on my application to build out the application. SpecKit simply says in the constitution that if you follow TDD, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that, like what sort of tests are you writing? Are you writing an outside-in test or an inside-out sort of test? All of that is very nebulous. A sort of it depends answer to your question is that these tools, they give you the wherewithal to do what you need to, but then the software engineering surface is something that we need to apply
It's
on
still
top of
yours.
it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we should define some terms. We're going fast. Gherkin. When people say that, I think of the it was associated with behavior-driven development or
That is
driven
correct.
design, given when then. Given someone has clicked on this button, when their account balance is below 50, then, something, something, something. It's a
Correct.
way to be very specific and not just sort of, as a user, I'd like to be able to add money, but more like, no, when this happens, this is exactly what should follow. Am I remembering right? And how does that compare to, you also used the phrase ATDD, which I think is acceptance
ATDD, which
test.
is acceptance
Yeah,
test
yeah,
driven
yeah. So
development.
can you get into that for a minute?
Absolutely. So let me just break down one of the features that I was showing you earlier. So let's say I'm trying to fix the SEO on my website here, and this is how my spec looks. Here's the given when then, which you actually called out. So my markdown file, I'm not really getting into a feature file here. Technically speaking, Gherkin would mean dot feature. That also I do at times, but I have like clear given when then, which means this translates well into a test case, right? These are acceptance criteria, which is defined from the point of view of what does the business want, like in this case, what I want from the website. And now this acceptance criteria can be directly translated into an acceptance test, which means that defines the done criteria for the feature itself once Cloud Code or Codex CLI has built it. What I mean by that is this usually translates into a playwright sort of test case. Maybe I don't even have to write the test these days because it's a CLI, right? So I'm able to invoke it using an agentic way of doing it, just a tool call and execute and test it out. So once the code is built, literally I have one more agent, which is a quality agent, which goes through this acceptance criteria and starts checking it off. Like, hey, is this acceptance criteria done? Is it done? Is it done? Is it done? So it's kind of doing that testing. And that's what I mean by saying one is this drives whether the design itself, like how it's done. And then post facto, once the code is built, this is also the way for me to verify whether it is actually done, so to speak. So that's how I'm driving it. So one, yes, ATDD is driving the overall direction for the code. And then there is test-driven development happening at the unit level, like functions and stuff, the whatever React code that is being written. That is again going through a TDD process, but that's an independent engineering surface. But this engineering surface is for me to keep the implementation in line with my intent.
So we're not opinionated. We allow for flexibility there.
Yeah.
Okay. Ari, this is cool. Thank
Yeah,
you for walking us through this a little bit. You're opening my eyes, and you're showing me stuff that I'm interested to try. Maybe I'll have to do an article about that at some point
absolutely.
where we get into it. We have some time remaining. We've spent a fair amount on this, which is good. But yeah, let's get into some of the questions that we ask all of our guests. You've talked a little bit about the tools you're building. You've talked a little
Mhm.
bit about the tools you're using. You mentioned Vim. You mentioned all the different models. What's your go-to right now? I'm going to assume Vim, but like, what's your go-to approach? Are you literally going back and forth between the different models all day, every day, or is that just a feature you
Yeah,
strive
yeah.
for? How are you using these tools?
For me, the go-to tools are Cloud Code, Open Code, and Codex CLI. These are my coding agents, essential bread and butter sort of tools. Within these, I obviously wire up all the different models because I like one model to opine on another model's work. So that way I get more reasonable outcomes, so to speak. It's more anecdotal and based on experience because I find GPT high reasoning sometimes and Claude being the best programmer. So these are things which I use. And obviously, my tooling landscape also involves a ton of LSP servers for all
Mm,
independent languages. And I have reduced my usage of MCP because, again, being context window sensitive,
yeah.
because MCP servers are fairly annoying. So I use a lot of CLI tools. Like I use RepoMix a lot to reduce the context window because it can pack your code
Mm,
into meaningful bite-sized chunks. So yeah, my go-to tools every day are largely the coding agents I mentioned. And all the models I do whip through all of them. And in some of the cases, the clients that I work with, they cannot afford to have an external model. They have a local LLM which they have to run because for technical and also for security reasons. So
costs. Yeah.
yeah, of course. And so for that reason, like, having the flexibility to switch models is always an important aspect of the daily workflow for me.
Yeah.
And sandboxes are a big part of my workflow because I don't want to constantly give permissions, but I also am paranoid of giving permissions to all these
Yeah.
agents. So I
Yeah.
do have sandboxes for everything. So I can sort of have that compartmentalization of, I can have this run dangerously without permissions within that
Yeah.
sandbox, of course.
Yeah, I noticed a cloud vendor that I actually do use the other day. It was saying, we'll give you ephemeral environments that you can let it, have all the permissions on, so it doesn't have to be your actual computer." And I thought, oh yeah, I can definitely see the value in that. Of course, it'd be nicer if you're not even paying for it by the minute. Okay, interesting. So we talked about some guardrails already. You talked about sandboxes. I think you mentioned something called repo mix, and I think you said that it's like a context window helper. It makes your code smaller, I think. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah.
Or
So
other
I
or
think,
other guardrails. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Repomix simplifying what it does, at least there are bunch of tools like Repomix. Basically, there is a bunch of context that gets used up in navigating your code base and getting all of that and then reading it using file tools and whatnot.
Yeah.
So a simple way of doing that is you pack all your code into a single file, so to speak, and then you ship it if you want to the context window. So it doesn't have to go back and forth and waste a ton of tokens. Again,
Wow.
the mileage you get out of such tools varies from coding agent to agent. Some agents are there intrinsically more optimized not to waste tokens for navigation, but others are not so much. So I kind of invariably end up using tools like this to say, hey, pack all the files within this particular folder and ship it for me. So it just puts it into a simple XML file and without having to go into the directory structure of it. And
I
yeah,
see.
again, these are some of the things which I use sparingly, where I am dealing with like brownfield largely because it's existing code. I do not want to say like, go read my 3 million lines of code and then tell me what to do. That wouldn't be a wise
Yeah.
place to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's where the tools come into picture.
I see. I see. So on the face of it, then it's not so much that they're reducing the number. They're not like literally taking a wordy Python approach and slimming it down through sort of compression techniques, one-liner tricks and party tricks like
There
that.
are tools
It's
which do that. Again,
yeah.
I don't know or haven't really pushed them to the limit there. I'm
Right.
sure there are more intelligent mechanisms, and I'm thinking even Repomix actually does a lot more than what I'm giving it credit for.
Sure.
But that said, like at least at its simplest form, they
Yeah,
are
and what the thing
reducing the
you're looking
nonsense.
for. So it may not be saving context tokens in terms of like the literal tokens in the code, but it's more the navigation because it's all in one
Yes,
file. It doesn't have to remember how to get from here to there. And okay,
correct.
got it. Nice. Cool. Any superpowers that these tools have that you were surprised by?
Oh yeah, okay. So I think the most recent ones which I'm really really happy about is especially the front end design capabilities
Mm.
that I got with Cloud Code has been really like I'm good at saying what looks aesthetically good, what is bad, right? But I'm really bad at translating that into actual look and feel. And
Hmm.
I have that difficulty even with having a designer. Like my designers always give me grief because I'm not good at articulating that. Using that design plugin in Cloud Code has been a boon. And then I
Yeah.
think even the more recent capabilities that have come into, let's say, Figma or even Cloud Design, where you can chat your design. Again, it's not the most optimal, I would say. There is still like component libraries and other things that still need to be taken care of. It's not a solved problem, but it
Right.
has certainly gotten me from, let's say, 10-20% to about 60-70%.
Cool.
So that's a big win for me, at least personally. I'm still surprised by how good it is at that, creating really nice, consistent UI. If I can define what my design system is once, and then I can have artifacts, even flyers and like, slide decks and everything created from one design system. That's been brilliant. Like, yeah, I love it. My designers also like it because they don't have to deal with me now. So this is better way of doing it.
Awesome. Awesome. Love it. Okay. Cool. So what about teams that you observe? We talked earlier about your role as CEO at Polarizer, helping enterprises adopt AI augmented development practices and so on. Are there markers for a team that's doing well versus markers for a team that's struggling? What sorts of processes are you using there?
That's a brilliant question. I think that's kind of the crux of my article, which we initially started off with, right? I think the biggest marker is not about technical capability or even to that matter, their AI chops, so to speak, right? The biggest marker I see is do they recognize how big of a shift it is? And do
Yeah.
they recognize the cultural aspect of it, right? One is using an AI coding agent is not about inculcating a developer tool into your daily practice. That's not at all it, because that would
Oh,
mean independent developer productivity is boosted and you get some certain percentage of it, right?
yeah.
This is a complete SDLC shift, like how the current system is a human centric workflow for building software systems, right? It is wired around our speed of development. It is wired around our speed of verification. It's not built for the compressed timelines that we're dealing with an AI
Yeah.
coding agent, right? If the team is recognizing this shift and they realize that it's more about intent articulation, it's not about like
Mm,
preserving the existing structure. I have a dev, I have QA teams, I have this, and this is the sequence in which it'll always work. We want to locally deploy AI agentic workflows there. Sure, you will get tactical advantages. I'm not denying that. And I'm
right,
seeing
right.
teams getting it. But you really want to push the envelope, you got to think about it as a cultural shift. You are hiring people onto the team, is how you should think about it when
Yeah.
you're getting a coding agent into that equation,
Mm,
because it takes your attention, it takes your effort. So how much thought we put into hiring someone and have them come up to speed and build stuff
on
for
board.
us, that's
Hmm.
exactly the kind of
Train,
thought process that
culture.
goes in.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's the biggest marker for me.
Interesting.
It's not even like, whether they know how to use all the interesting features in Cloud Code, agent teams,
Right,
sub agents, all that. But it's
right.
just your thought process of, can I get my intent across as an individual and as a group
Yeah.
to this
Cool.
system?
I love what you're saying, and what's coming up for me when you say that, I think for those of us, and that's maybe still me right now, that are using this as an amplifier for individual productivity, we sort of hit a bit of a wall at like the PR level pretty often. It's like, okay, it can go really fast, isn't that cool? But now what? And I think some teams are sort of trying to say like, oh, well, we have a really good test suite. And so like maybe the PR side isn't as important somehow. And that seems like maybe it'll work. But it seems like with OpenSpec and some of the stuff that you're doing, there's maybe a second possibility that if you have this really good system of intent tracking, this really good system of understanding what the system should be, well, then maybe you can trust it to give PRs. Like right now, if you ask an agent to give you a pull request review on almost any code. It can write you pages about what's wrong, and maybe some of it's kind of important. And maybe there's a gem in there that's really important, but some of it's just, I don't know, like it just talking. It's like, that doesn't really matter. But with the intent-driven tools that you're talking about, like maybe that gets us a little bit further, or I don't know, maybe I'm being aggrandizing there. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely on point there in terms of the concept you're going towards, if I'm not wrong, is actually very close to this thing which has recently become popular called software dark factories. Wherein, like, your agents don't sleep at night. They're available to you 24/7. So
Yeah,
why have them, like, why do
right.
we have to stay glued to the screen when they
Yeah,
can build the code? So what we are trying to do is put a system in place which can then have this agent go and build tools off of. Now, the important piece here to understand is that if I see a bug, the temptation is to go fix that bug in the code, right? But the bug is a symptom of something missing in the specification, or it's
yeah.
probably a symptom of something missing in the
Or in
intent
harness or
articulation phase.
something.
Yeah. So that's what we want to get into, right? If I may again take one moment to share my screen. It is quite a read, this article. I apologize if it's quite long. But yeah, so I think what I'm trying to get to is this setup, right? Like if there is a gap in the overall implementation, it could signal an issue in the implementation itself. And that's an easy fix, which is where the tests and stuff come in. Like, they catch an issue, they fix it, and yeah, you go back to a better implementation. But it could also mean that there is something lacking in your specification, which is you have not been articulate enough in your communication of intent. So it could be a issue here. And why is that? Potentially because the conversations we had with the AI or with each other did not elicit that intent very well. Maybe it needs, like, we need to talk about accessibility more explicitly rather than, like, we forgot about it, right? So the next time we go through the process of creating a user story, it has to pop up that question to say, have you thought about accessibility? And that's where the hardness feedback comes into picture, and the entire SDD workflow itself could be modified. That could be the feedback to that. So essentially, what you're looking at is if you have a system in place that can generate software, and progressively you can keep on improving it over a period of time, you will get to that state which you're calling out, Kyle, which is eventually the software factory, where our jobs is largely to ideate and articulate intent, and it's the agent or the job of the agents to execute on the stuff that we have put out. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Okay, I think I get this. What's instinctive to me about what I'm looking at is you're talking about, like, there's feedback for the process, there's feedback for the specification. Like, instead of fixing the code, like, how do you fix the system so that the code
Hmm.
is correct next time? I'm with you on all of that. When you get into Dark Factory, to me, it brings up, there's a little bit of a debate right now. Is this more like a waterfall style approach? How does this look then? Like, the humans are just spending our time writing these specs and having these conversations that get these intents to be recorded. And then, like, what, we push a button and, overnight they go and make the thing. Okay, sometimes in software development, we do have just sort of a big pile of work that either can be well understood or already is well understood. And it just needs to be written down,
Hmm.
and then that writing needs to be self-checked for internal cohesion and consistency. And then, we can actually have fairly high confidence that if the robots build this overnight, it will be a good thing. There's work like that, right? And there's some question even there that, like, are you really sure that the spec was right? If you're not there with the dark factory while it's building, you might still miss things. But let's set that aside.
Hmm.
Not every problem is so knowable, right? And I'm sometimes surprised by when I actually need discovery and when I don't. Sometimes
Hmm.
I think when I'm sitting down with Claude, like, oh, I know what I need. I just need to describe it to it. And then I see it online later and I'm like, that's not what I meant. Or that's what I said, but I'm wrong. Right. And so discovery and learning, for us, the writers of the intent, I think is an important part of the creative process. And sometimes, how many times have you worked with a designer or an experienced designer and you implement it the way they ask, and then they look at it and they're like, oh no, right, this is actually going to be better this way,
Yeah.
right? Interactions can change meaning, can change context. So when I think about these dark factories, there's this whole debate around, is spec-driven actually good, or are we going back to waterfall? But to me, what's more interesting is this, like, aren't we losing something? Just like when you outsource, we used to talk about, like, if a business outsources a really critical function in a way where they lose access to what's happening as part of the process of doing that function, the business itself becomes sort of poorer for it and less understanding.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
outsource in a way that you retain that knowledge, you're in a better shape. So these dark factories, I don't know, are they the right approach? Like, what do you think?
See, I think the dark factory as a concept, I kind of look at it as something to aspire to in terms of what is the possibility, right? Whether I want to get there is a different question. But if I can reach for the moon, then, like, say, like 80% of it is probably still very practical and pragmatic point of view. That is one. Like, from the point of view of whether how much hype there is versus what is reality, I still think it's a very good goal to aim towards. But how far you want to get along that is a personal choice and independent setup. The second point which you actually hit is very important is, isn't this waterfall? Isn't it like we are having to force ourselves to think ahead of time every single detail so that this thing can build at night? Otherwise, I'm going to be waking up in the morning to something that is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
So the reality of spec-driven development, honestly, is I think it doesn't have to be looked at as once I write the spec, there's no way back for me. That's not really true. Just like how we, right? Like, I think even Ken Beck had recently posted on LinkedIn. In TDD, the whole joy of the process is I write a test. I build the implementation. In the process, I learn something. I go back and fix the test. And I go back and write the code again. So there's test feeding into the code and the code feeding back into the test. There's a learning going on here. And I look at it exactly like that with spec-driven development. More often than not, I get the spec wrong. And it's not like I'm getting it right in very first shot. And my features are not like I'm specifying the entire application all at once. So like I showed you earlier, I'm building small little features. I'm lining it up. Maybe the first time, not even sure if I've articulated enough very well. So I'll actually build it out, right? To see how it looks. And then if it's not what I want, I'll throw away the code. I'll go back to the spec. I'll fix it. I'll go back and forth a little bit. I can afford to do this a lot because what am I losing? My build time is hardly 5 minutes to 10 minutes. So I've gained so much time during the build that I don't need to be stingy with how I plan, right? So I can try multiple things. I can even have like the same feature built two, three different ways and then learn from it before I actually say, okay, now I'm happy with the spec. Let's build it, go into regression testing and whatnot and verify it. So,
Well, and I think part of what excited me about OpenSpec when you were showing it just now is that I could imagine it being iterative. I can imagine being, you start out today and I think your acceptance criteria was some, basically SEO, when they're
Hmm.
looking at the services page and the web crawler comes. I can imagine it being like, okay, tomorrow we realize, I kind of want something different. And that there's a process for like taking that new different thing and going and applying that concept to like the past, right? So there's still a process for iteration there and maybe even simplifying that iteration. So I think that's part of what I was attracted to about what I was seeing. Yeah. Because it is that iteration. That's the important bit. Like, I'm not sure I need to iterate on every for loop. For loops are iterative. Ha. But getting the parenthesis right, I don't think I care about iterating over that. But iterating over the spec, I care a lot about. So yeah, to me, dark factory sounds like you're losing some of that. And maybe it's just a phrase. I don't know.
So I think a dark factory is like this, right? If you really want to go down the factory analogy, even industrial production goes through prototypes and then actual
Yeah.
user products. I'm not going to ship my prototype car model to person, right? I have multiple iterations of that. I have
Yeah.
multiple iterations of my assembly line itself. But
Yeah.
what I'm shipping is something that I'm really sure of. And all our software essentially is a mix of different types of features.
Yeah.
Some are more dull and boring and rinse and repeat sort of features, versus others are a little bit more requires a thought process. And like you rightly put it, we cannot afford to outsource thinking. We can
Yeah.
afford to outsource execution. And the concept of factory for me is to keep thinking to ourselves so that we can think through some of the more complex features, keep the joy of building more challenging features to us.
Yeah.
And while there is run of the mill features which we have to keep doing, and that's where we could take help from the agent to get that job done for us. So
Yeah.
it's a platter, right? It's not like one size fits all for all features.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. We've touched a little bit on how all this changes product management quite a lot about how this approach and your not just your approach but your implementation of that approach,
Hmm.
Open Spec, on how it's opinionated about product management and story breakdown.
Hmm.
We've talked a little bit about architecture and planning. We talked about software development itself, about testing, integration. When you think about how generative AI tooling is changing deployment, what are you seeing out there right
It's a great point. And in fact, that harks back to what we discussed in the beginning, right? And spec driven development or more structured dialogue, you're separating the business from the technology and then you're building it out. So, which means when you separate the business, the what is a separate document, and then there are various engineering surfaces you're applying to it. One is technically architecture, which kind of defines your repository structure, what is the tech stack, and whatnot. Second is your deployment. Now, I can say that, hey, I am going to deploy my applications in such and such a way, which means that is what decides my Helm charts, my Kubernetes structure, and where this application needs to go. There could be one more layer, which is a security aspect to it. So that brings in the layer of, what is the compliance that I'm looking at? What sort of, SBOM that I'm supposed to be compliant with? So those are all things which start feeding into layer by layer detailing. And then all of this put together goes into that task list eventually. And the task list is the execution surface, right? And the execution surface then is able to generate artifacts, not just of the code itself, but it's also generating like deployment artifacts. It's generating security assessments and so on. So what it's doing is all the roles that we have, we can then generate skills or agents out of it, which can then opine on the feature that's being built and eventually contribute to the long list of things that need to be done by the agent. And that's the control surface for me.
Great. Okay, cool. And in there, you ended up touching on not just deployment, but infrastructure. And you talked about dependency management, SBOM, your software bill of materials. I guess that's
Yeah,
where you're
yeah,
thinking about like what libraries you're allowed to use and not. Go ahead.
correct. That is correct.
Yeah, yeah, okay. But so here's a question that I've personally been wrestling with a little bit. What do you think happens to pair programming? What do you think happens to
Oh, yeah.
mob programming with all of this stuff?
So pair programming was largely about framing and then solving between two of us, and we could exercise different muscles and we could go on for some time, right? These days, my pair programmer, so to speak, is the coding agent. And that's how I look at it. I'm overall framing for it and it is solving for me. The one part I miss about it is the other partner should ideally frame the problem for me and me solving it so I can keep going back and forth. I don't see that happening. So right now I'm more
Right.
of frame, and then
Yeah.
the coding agent does solve. As a team, if you're looking at it, I also use a ton of sub-agents and agent teams, etc. So it's not just one agent I'm talking to. So I'm submitting work to a team of agents, right? So what I do is just for fun, sometimes I and actually for good benefit, is I create a pair of engineers. So like one is the adversarial of the other, and they kind of
Mm,
fight between each other. Again, in good spirit to get the right content out for me, right? Agents try to please us as much as possible. So for one
right.
agent, if my goal is write the code, the other one is try and find a way to break this code, right? So then I can have both of them sort of do that duel and come back to me with code that I would be happy with. So yeah, that's the current version of pair programming I'm
Oh
dealing
my
with.
God. Right. Yeah. No, it makes sense. Holy cow. What cultural shift do you think is required for AI native software development lifecycle?
Yeah. So for me, the big shift is the fact that conversations are more important, right? I think thought that okay, there's new models coming out every day. There's Opus and there's Mythos, and everyone's like, okay, we just want more intelligent models, and the models will sort of magically do better, and they do. I'm
Mm,
not denying that models are definitely getting better at figuring out code and whatnot. But the bigger point here is, am I trying to hire more smarter engineers and then just hope that they'll read my mind? That's not necessarily true, right?
right.
I want to be able to have a conversation, have a system in place for collaborating properly, so that irrespective of models that I'm using, I should be able to get consistent output. And that I feel is really important as a cultural shift, to focus on the conversation with AI rather than looking at it as an instruction, right? It's a collaborative context building.
Yeah.
Why that is critical is almost like that takes you out of lock-in. Analogy wise, do I want to lock in myself with smarter models and I cannot deal with like maybe the $2 model or the $20 model? I only need a 200.
Right.
So I feel the collaborative context building sort of wins hands down when it and compared to like saying, I'll just depend on the model itself. So
Yeah.
that's my big cultural shift that is necessary to think about individually as well as teams. This kind of goes at
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
level.
for sure. Well, and I think you've touched on how you hire staff, train, mentor, and I think you're right. The culture, it is definitely more and more. This job is going to have to be about understanding the business domain and talking about the business domain and talking about the intent, talking about the problem you're trying to solve. So I think that's 100% right. Are you seeing anything change around like role ratios, right? Like there was a time when you could almost have a little bit of a magic framework of like, if you've got 5 developers, you're going to need one business analyst and maybe a QA, depending on how you're doing QA. And these ratios kind of stood for a long time. Obviously, they would need adjustment, but you could kind of stamp them out a little bit. Is that changing? Like some people say like, oh, we're clearly going to need more testers. And some people say, oh, we're going to need more SMEs. And some people say, well, we're all product people now. Like, but yeah. What are you seeing in terms of the impact of role ratios and how many developers to QA to BA and all of this?
I think the wave is yet to hit a lot more companies than we would like to see right now. Right now, at least
Yeah.
this is my experience, right? In my clients, we're trying to move to help the existing teams get where they want to with the current structure. And within those roles, I am seeing no problem at all when people move from, let's say, everyone universally needs to get more product acumen, so to speak, right? They need to understand the product or the business that they're trying to deal with, because they're
Yeah.
elevating themselves from the day-to-day grunt of like actually executing. So that is a given. In terms of ratios in the team, I don't see a reason why to change right now, because at least the fact that everyone had their position, so to speak, from a human centric workflow point of view, and there
Mhm.
were a certain ratio required to satisfy that. But if you take the same ratio and apply it to putting the system together, like of agents, you right now, like let's take example of QA, right? I like that example a lot because I feel like unnecessarily we say that, oh, we don't need QAs or we need more QAs. What we really need is, what does the QA do now? The point is the QA has to now ensure the quality of the harness or the
Mm.
quality of the system that is putting the context together to build the application, so that
Yep.
the bugs don't get created in the first place, right? So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
still a
yeah, yeah.
lot of work, still a lot of software engineering that needs to be done in the system building. And if you have as many developers, if you have as many QAs, as long as you're able to push them on to like system building part of it, it still works, that ratio. But honestly, I don't want to say like, this ratio will continue to work
Yeah,
forever.
we don't know. Yeah.
In due course, I think the biggest thing that's going to happen is for all of us to become more business centric and actually user centric, because as we push these things out, we need to be able to look at it as better systems thinkers rather than individual roles. We could still be SMEs, but we are largely a uncollective mind trying to stage work for the agent.
Wow, that's nice. Cool. One collective mind indeed. Okay. So you've been very generous with your time, but we're sort of rolling towards a close. There's three questions I ask everybody at the end of this. And
Sure.
you can definitely answer these like about your career, about AI, whatever, but it can also just sort of be anything in your life, right? The first one, almost everyone answers the same way. So if you fall into that trap, I will point it out. But so the first question, what is something you've had to change your mind on? Something that you thought you were right about for a long time and realized, oh, wait, no, that's not true. Like, what comes up for you when I ask that?
Have been proven wrong more than once, right? And this has been the recent time that this has been again a deja vu moment. I always thought of like technology for the sake of technology, right? But practically, technology is a way to address human aspect of it. It's a way to address the political aspect, dynamic of it in teams or companies and whatnot. So for me, architecture was the first time when I was trying to do digital transformation sort of work. I realized that architecture was a vehicle for me to enable good dynamics in the team. And how you
Hmm.
technically put systems together is how you get people to positively collaborate with each other. So that's number one. And eventually, I did. So I think that dynamics still plays an important role and whatnot. And now with I again see the collaboration aspect of it. What I feel humbled about is you gotta give people more credit than what we do. At least for me, usually the people dynamics is most important. Technology comes later. So if I put people first, that's how I stumbled upon intent-driven development as an idea and developed on it, and
Hmm.
it kind of goes well for me. And I'm really happy I'm standing corrected in terms of not overly focusing on AI and saying, hey, I don't really need a team. I badly need a team now than like ever. And uh, this is one yet another proof that I've had to change my mind. Like, which is knowing
Interesting.
people always is more important than knowing tech.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. What's something you're most proud of?
In recent times, I think what I'm most proud of is like being able to enable people who they're really smart, much better than I am at critical thinking and whatnot. But probably their articulation capability, language, and other things were what was stopping them from achieving what they wanted. But
Mm.
now using like this coding tools and coding agents and interacting with them with some of the groups that I've been working with, even people are able to use like our vernacular language to build software, and I'm able to get a few young chaps to build software from purely like local languages like Kannada or Tamil, and that's very big win for me. I'm still in the early stages of it, and I love that part, right? Like to say I don't need this individual to know English or
Wow.
converse that build
Yeah.
stuff. Like I'm still in the early phases of that, but if there's anything I'd be proud of that small bit.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. We talk about like, these languages come from C with the curly braces and the semicolons, and these languages come from basic. And it's like, no, they all come from English in the end. So I love where you're going. That's awesome. Cool. What's something that's giving you joy right now?
So I think I've rediscovered sort of being closer to program and code. There's a lot more code I see compared to like again being a consultant. A large part of my time, I imagine you can realize it goes towards like people interaction, setting up dynamics and systems and stuff like that. Building things is something that I've been yearning to do a lot more of, and now I'm really addicted to like building stuff. Like an idea I have, I can take it to implementation very quickly, see it take shape very quickly, right? That's in a way, I don't know, it's a good thing or yeah, it is a good thing. Like it's addictive. It's very nice to see I don't have to be limited by my time. It's the agent can multiply the ability to execute is what's giving me joy right now.
Amazing. Amazing. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Kyle. I think it's wonderful having a conversation with you, and thank you for having me.